What happens when the people born to rule kingdoms can't even rule themselves? From velvet thrones to opium dens, royal courts across history hid a darker truth. Kings drunk on power and actual drink, queens numbed by grief and morphine. Behind every crown was a bottle, a vial, a secret prescription whispered behind palace doors. These are the sovereigns who reigned under the influence of liquor, laudanum, paranoia, and pain. Welcome to 33 Worst Royal Junkies in History, a descent into the gilded dysfunction they never taught you in school. And no, they couldn't stop at just one. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button. It helps keep these stories alive. And trust me, things are about to get royally unhinged. Let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it right now? Midnight in Madrid? 3 a.m. in Manila? We're building a global court of night owls and history fiends. You belong here. 1. King George IV of the United Kingdom. It is said that if you stood outside Carlton House on a quiet evening in the 1820s, you could hear the future of the British Empire slurring its speech. Inside, amidst the velvet drapes and gilded mirrors, the man once dubbed the first gentleman of Europe was dissolving into his upholstery, one brandy-soaked night at a time. George IV did not merely drink, he marinated. His liver, according to one physician, had expanded to a disgusting sponge. By the time he ascended the throne in 1820, he had been functionally intoxicated for most of his adult life, a walking port decanter in breeches. But to understand George's fall, one has to appreciate how much of it was staged, theatrically, extravagantly, and with all the dysfunction money could buy. Born into privilege, George came of age in a palace but was raised by ghosts. His father, George III, famously mad and obsessively pious, saw indulgence as sin. So naturally, his son made indulgence a spiritual discipline. As Prince Regent, George didn't just rebel, he curated decadence. Tailored silk jackets, Chinese porcelain, entire dining tables engineered to disappear into the floor when the brandy came out. It was not enough to escape his father. He had to bury the past under barrels of claret and laudanum. Contemporaries noticed. The Times referred to him as a bloated Narcissus with a goblet for a mirror. He had his own cocktail of choice, a mixture of brandy and laudanum, essentially opium dissolved in alcohol. It worked faster than politics and was less likely to start a war. His typical night, by many accounts, included a starter of champagne, a main course of claret, and then brandy, until the voices stopped. This wasn't just bad behavior, it was self-erasure. George was racked with gout, obesity, paranoia, and likely undiagnosed mental illness. Alcohol dulled the screaming joints, laudanum dulled everything else. He took opiates to sleep, then more to wake. He drifted through parliamentary sessions like a beached whale in a powdered wig. When he did speak, it was in bombast or gibberish. His courtiers developed a system of coded glances to communicate over his babble. No one dared interrupt the king, not even when he stopped making sense. Some historians suggest his addiction was a slow-moving suicide, but let's be careful. There's nothing romantic about decay in ermine. George's body eventually became a monument to collapse. By his late 50s, he could barely walk. He reportedly had to be carried to the toilet, which he used while seated on a custom velvet chair. He ate until he bled. He drank until he hallucinated. He ruled only in the technical sense. Still, what makes George IV more than just a grotesque curiosity is the empire he left behind. His addictions were not isolated. They were embedded in the marble of the institutions he led. The British court learned to function around dysfunction. Ministers wrote legislation in his name while he slept through his own signature. The machinery of power kept humming, even as its pilot mistook laudanum dreams for foreign policy. And then there's this. Despite all his excess, George IV was adored by some. He was elegant, charming, a lover of art and architecture. He redesigned Windsor Castle. He helped shape Regency fashion. He hosted Beethoven. He also, at one point, declared he had fought at Waterloo. He had not. That was the drink talking. But maybe the most unsettling thing about George IV is not that he governed drunk. It's that the system didn't particularly mind. Because if the king could disappear into a golden bottle and the country still ran, what exactly did he ever rule? Of course, that question only gets murkier when the next monarch takes the throne and brings her own secret stash of tinctures to the table. 2. Queen Victoria. The world remembers her as the granite-hearted matriarch of an empire that never set, a widow draped in eternal black, a monarch who presided over railways, revolutions and tea. But Queen Victoria was also a woman who, behind the veils and the portraits, turned quietly and persistently to the warm silence of a drugged fog. Unlike her son Edward or her uncle George, Victoria did not host orgies or pass out mid-council. Her addictions were not theatrical, they were domestic, private. They came in amber bottles with labels like opium tincture, chloroform lozenges, or nerve tonic. 3 drops daily. She was, in a sense, the founding mother of respectable dependency. A woman of upright spine who just happened to float through decades of grief and governance on a laudanum cloud. The line between treatment and indulgence was never clear, nor was it meant to be. Victorian England had an entire industry built on euphemism. Laudanum was the nurse's friend, chloroform was the gentle lull, and a sovereign's pain, that was just female delicacy. Victoria bore 9 children, several personal tragedies, and a husband she loved with frightening intensity. The medicine cabinet became her confessional. She began using laudanum early, possibly in childbirth, more certainly after. The physicians of the day believed opiates were a natural solution to hysteria, melancholy, or womb irritability, a term which basically covered every emotional state between joy and rage. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, something inside Victoria stopped functioning. The official term was mourning. The reality was likely closer to long-term depressive disorder, laced with grief-induced panic attacks, agoraphobia, and what modern psychiatry might call complicated bereavement. Her journals from that era are full of fog. There are long gaps, odd repetitions, rhapsodic outpourings followed by cold silence. She frequently references feeling ill or weak or in need of my drops. These drops, of course, were not harmless. Laudanum is tinctured opium in alcohol, essentially a pharmaceutical sigh. Small doses numb, large ones erase. Victoria walked that line daily. Then came the chloroform. First administered during her 8th childbirth, chloroform was embraced by Victoria so enthusiastically that it transformed public perception. Before her, anesthesia was controversial. After her, it was modern. Her words, "blessed chloroform," were reprinted across medical journals like a royal endorsement for oblivion. And behind that medical revolution was a simple truth. The Queen wanted out. Not out of life, but out of consciousness. The buzzing, burning brain, the weight of memory, the repetition of duty, and maybe, though she never wrote it aloud, the presence of herself. She was not addicted in the gutter sense. She didn't lose her crown or her faculties, but she needed it. There is a difference. Addiction doesn't always announce itself with slurred speech and lost fortunes. Sometimes it wears a mourning brooch and writes impeccable thank you notes. Victoria took her drops, took her throne, and took the British Empire into its most expansive century, all while carefully numbing the sharp edges of existence. And her people loved her for it. Or rather, they loved the version of her that was presented. The unflinching widow, the national grandmother, the imperial constant. What they didn't see, or chose not to see, was the Queen who cried on the floor at night and reached, not for scripture, but for an opium bottle that promised a few hours of stillness. The irony? The empire she ruled was also increasingly built on opiates, in medicine, in trade, and in war. Victoria dulled her grief with the same substance British ships were flooding into China. But personal or political, public or private, when a sovereign's pain becomes policy, someone else is always left to clean up the mess. And speaking of inherited habits, the next monarch didn't just drink to dull the pain. He drank because the whole world was burning, and he needed something to toast as it turned to ash. If you're still with us after Queen Victoria's laudanum-laced fog, you already know this isn't your average history class. Take a second to subscribe if you haven't yet. It keeps this strange royal rabbit hole going. And while you're at it, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Late night in London? Sunrise in Sao Paulo? We're all just time travelers in bathrobes, listening to history unravel. 3. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. There's a photograph of Tsar Nicholas II taken in 1917, shortly before his abdication. His uniform is crisp, his beard immaculate, his eyes empty. Not the romantic emptiness of a brooding monarch, but the flat vacancy of a man watching the walls collapse around him and deciding quietly to open another bottle of cognac. Nicholas didn't start out as a drunk, he started out as a disappointment. The son of the iron-willed Tsar Alexander III, he inherited a throne he was neither prepared for nor particularly interested in. From the beginning, Nicholas ruled with the energy of a man trying to wake up from a nap, distracted, passive, ever hopeful that someone else might make the hard decisions. Alcohol helped with that, not in the loud, indulgent way of George IV or the medicinal haze of Victoria. No, for Nicholas, drinking was more of a disappearance, a slow, intentional fade into the soft light of detachment. Champagne, sweet wines, brandy, and especially cognac, these were staples at the imperial table. But behind the public toasts and ceremonial glasses, there was another, quieter ritual. Nicholas drank to cope, first with the pressures of rule, then with the failures of his own governance, then with the mounting deaths of his people, the rise of revolution, the humiliation of war, and finally with the death of his dynasty, still unfolding in slow motion. His diaries are obsessively tidy, a running log of dinners, walks and drinks that read closely become a kind of coded journal of despair. Mentions of quiet evenings with a cigar and wine appear with increasing frequency as the 1910s progress. Slept poorly, drank after dinner, worried, he notes. It's the repetition that strikes hardest. By 1916, the world was coming undone, and the Tsar was still logging what he ate and what he drank, as if organizing the end of the Romanovs into digestible categories might make it feel less inevitable. But Nicholas wasn't entirely numb. There were flashes of insight, private acknowledgements that things were spiraling. In one letter to a confidant, he admits to feeling hollowed out and weak before God. That weakness, so thoroughly at odds with the myth of autocracy, is where his drinking settled in like a quiet guest who never left. It didn't destroy him all at once. It just dulled him, blunted his instincts, softened his panic. And in a world collapsing under the weight of industrial war, ideological revolution and starvation, dullness was a form of death. His dependence was never declared, never made official. The court covered for him. The public still bowed, and his inner circle, including the infamous Rasputin, enabled it. Rasputin, after all, wasn't just a mystic, he was a drinking companion. He brought not only prophecy, but vodka. And Nicholas, desperate for a stabilizing force, accepted both, as if magical thinking and heavy drink might somehow cancel each other out. By the time Nicholas abdicated in 1917, he was a ghost in his own palace, a Tsar in name only, drifting through the wreckage of centuries with a bottle in one hand and a prayer in the other. His exile didn't change much. He continued his habits in captivity, routine, orderly, and quietly soaked. There are reports of him walking the snow-covered paths of Tobolsk with a flask under his coat, still pretending he was going somewhere. But perhaps the most unsettling legacy of Nicholas II's drinking is how invisible it was allowed to become, because the final Romanov wasn't overthrown in a blaze of madness. He faded, quietly, numbly, diplomatically, into history, drink by drink. And he wasn't the only one. His British cousin had a similar weakness, though with less tragedy and far more spectacle. After all, if Nicholas drank to forget the empire's end, Edward VII drank to celebrate that it hadn't ended yet. 4. King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. It's difficult to say where Edward VII's bloodstream ended and Moet and Chandon began. The man didn't just drink, he orchestrated his inebriation like an art form. Champagne with breakfast, port with lunch, cognac after hunting, brandy before dinner, liqueurs after dinner, and just a hint of whiskey, medicinal of course, to help the royal eyelids cooperate with gravity. If his cousin Nicholas II drank to vanish, Edward drank to arrive. To understand Edward, you have to understand boredom, specifically the kind of imperial boredom that afflicts a man born into absolute wealth and zero responsibility for most of his life. As Prince of Wales, he waited longer than any other heir in British history to ascend the throne. Nearly 60 years of ceremonial ribbon-cutting, diplomatic handshakes, and mild contempt from his famously moral mother, Queen Victoria. She called him idle, newspapers called him indulgent, but he was simply waiting. And while he waited, he became very, very good at entertaining himself. This entertainment required stamina, and Edward's body, surprisingly, cooperated. For a time, his court became synonymous with decadence, a place where meals lasted 5 hours and every course came with a different wine pairing. Not because anyone needed that much wine, but because Edward needed that many distractions. His preferred brand of pleasure was French. He spent more time in Paris than most British diplomats, forging personal alliances with chefs, sommeliers, and courtesans. French restaurants still honor his memory with menus a la Edward VII, which is to say, liver-threatening. His daily calorie count read like a death wish, yet he carried it all with jovial aplomb, a monarch not weighed down by empire, but buoyed by Bordeaux. But the drink wasn't just for fun, it was also quietly for function. Edward had a natural charisma that could paper over most cracks, but not all. He had inherited his mother's anxiety, his father's sense of inadequacy, and a public image that oscillated between charming rogue and national embarrassment. Alcohol smoothed the transitions. It made him more sociable, more bearable to himself, more performative, and less likely to pause long enough to feel irrelevant. Yet here lies the twist. Edward, for all his indulgence, was actually quite effective once he finally got the job. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, many expected him to be a national liability in a crown. Instead, he surprised them. He modernized the monarchy's image, pursued diplomatic outreach, and was instrumental in laying the foundations of the Triple Entente. He drank constantly and ruled competently. It begs the uncomfortable question, what if dysfunction isn't always disqualifying? What if the empire could function, even thrive, under a monarch fueled by foie gras and fortified wine? Of course, the cracks were still there. Health declined sharply in his later years. The cost of perpetual indulgence was cardiac, not moral. He died in 1910, just as the world began its ominous lurch toward war. His son, George V, was far more sober and far less interesting. But the legacy of Edward's lifestyle didn't die with him. It left a trail, menus, myths, and a monarchy increasingly fluent in the art of private self-destruction and public stability. The king had shown that you could drink like a libertine and still wear a crown, so long as the tabloids played along and the empire held. And yet, some royal figures drank not to pass the time or charm a room, but to soothe something far colder, exile, humiliation, and the slow rot of obscurity. Which brings us to a queen whose reign lasted only one winter, but whose glass rarely ran dry. 5. Queen Elizabeth of Bohemia, the Winter Queen. History knows her as the Winter Queen, a poetic title for a tragic reign that lasted roughly as long as a frost. But Elizabeth Stuart, daughter of James I of England, sister to Charles I, might more accurately be remembered as a woman who drank to keep her memory from melting. She was born into grandeur, married into war, and exiled into irrelevance. And somewhere between courtly dances and foreign invasions, Elizabeth found herself reaching again and again for the only thing the 30 Years' War hadn't taken from her: wine and opiates steeped in wine, and then a little more wine for good measure. Elizabeth's addiction wasn't scandalous, it was practical. She was a queen without a throne, a royal who never stopped performing royalty, even as her family scattered, her money dried up, and her titles became little more than polite fiction. What else could she do but sip and smile and write letters to monarchs who had stopped replying? It's in those letters that her dependency starts to flicker through the cracks. Her correspondence becomes more erratic, more florid. She repeats herself, offers odd bits of sentimental wisdom, sometimes misdates entire pages. Her handwriting wobbles, her thoughts loop, but always there is an insistence that she is fine, that things will improve, that the war will end and she will be restored. She never was. After her husband Frederick V, the so-called Winter Kings, lost the throne of Bohemia following one disastrous season of rule, the two fled into exile with their growing brood of children. He died young, defeated, and poor. Elizabeth lived on for 5 more decades. 5 decades of letters, mourning, cold European boarding houses, and slow deterioration, dressed in silks that no longer fit. Accounts from her attendants describe a woman both dignified and increasingly detached. She entertained visitors with forced cheer, holding salons where the wine always flowed and the conversation often wandered. Her reliance on tinctured opiates became a whispered truth among courtiers. They were meant for nerves, for female vapors, for the general sense of loss that had settled into her bones. And why not? She had once been raised as the possible heir to 3 crowns. Instead, she spent her later years watching her children and grandchildren marry into foreign courts, some aligning with enemies, others dying before their time. Her youngest son, Rupert, found some fame as a cavalier in the English Civil War, but even his exploits couldn't lift the family name from the mud. Every time she looked out from her window in The Hague, the Dutch fog must have reminded her just how far Bohemia really was. There's something unsettling about the way Elizabeth clung to her identity. Even in ruin, she styled herself as a queen. Her correspondence bore royal seals. Her conversation insisted on ceremony. The world had told her no for decades, and still she toasted herself as if reality were simply late to arrive. Addiction, in her case, was less about destruction and more about suspension, a long, slow holding pattern above the wreckage of her former life. And like all self-administered anesthesia, it worked until it didn't. She died in 1662 after nearly 50 years in exile, having outlived her husband, many of her children, and the political cause that once crowned her. But even in death, she was stubborn. She requested to be buried in Westminster Abbey alongside her royal ancestors, and eventually they let her. A final, ironic restoration, but not before history had nearly forgotten her, not before the wine had dulled her name into something half-remembered. But the next royal didn't have to wait for exile to come apart. His collapse began in the palace itself, behind velvet curtains, under the influence of chemicals that blurred the line between madness and monarchy. 6. King Christian VII of Denmark. There are monarchs who drink because they're bored, some because they're grieving, and then there's King Christian VII of Denmark, who drank, smoked and dosed himself into oblivion because reality itself had stopped making sense. He was crowned in 1766 at the age of 17, but it wasn't a coming of age. It was an unraveling. Court physicians and later historians widely agree that Christian suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. But the 18th century didn't diagnose, it sedated. And in Christian's case, sedation became his lifestyle. He was prescribed a rotating pharmacy of alcohol, laudanum, herbal opiates, and early barbiturates. any mixture that could soften his violent moods and calm the unwholesome fantasies he reportedly described to his attendants. From a young age, Christian displayed erratic behavior, compulsive tics, sudden outbursts, paranoia, and emotional disconnection. Rather than confront the uncomfortable truth that their king was unfit to rule, his advisors simply numbed him into compliance. And Christian was all too willing. By his 20s, he was chemically flattened, wandering the gilded halls of Copenhagen Palace in a medicated daze. Courtiers whispered of his blank stares, of hours spent talking to himself, of sudden laughter during state meetings. When he wasn't hallucinating, he was drinking, not with celebratory flair, but with the dull desperation of someone trying to erase their own mind. Reports say he consumed staggering amounts of wine and brandy daily, often in solitude. Yet for all his fragility, Christian's story didn't unfold in isolation. Because when a monarch loses grip, a vacuum forms, and someone always steps in. In his case, that someone was Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician who initially entered court as Christian's doctor, but rapidly ascended to become his de facto ruler. Struensee saw the king's instability not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. He prescribed sedatives to Christian with one hand and wrote reformist decrees with the other. Over just 2 years, he introduced more than 1,000 laws in the king's name, abolishing torture, modernizing administration, and terrifying the nobility in the process. The court watched, stunned, as the kingdom was effectively ruled by a doctor, a queen, Caroline Matilda, with whom Struensee had an affair, and a puppet king too drugged to protest. But such arrangements rarely last. In 1772, a palace coup ended the experiment. Struensee was executed. The queen was exiled, and Christian, he simply lingered for another 40 years, alive but absent. Technically king, but functionally forgotten. He remained in royal residences, kept under supervision, medicated, occasionally wheeled out for ceremonies where he was expected to smile and wave but not speak. The palace made no serious effort to restore his authority. The sedation continued, in substance and in symbolism. Denmark chose to rule without a mind on the throne rather than confront what it meant to have crowned a sick boy and then silenced him with tinctures. Christian VII's legacy is as blurry as his reign. He left behind no great speeches, no bold decisions, no iconic wars or reforms, just an empire quietly run by others and a tragic footnote in European history. A boy king turned ghost by the very medicines that were meant to keep him sane. But some royals didn't vanish with such quiet. The next queen still smiled for portraits, still waved from carriages, even as her world narrowed into rooms full of morphine bottles and silent shrinking mirrors. 7. Queen Alexandra of the United Kingdom. She was elegant, regal, and almost mythically adored. Queen Alexandra, consort to Edward VII, and mother to George V, became a symbol of grace in an era otherwise bloated with decadence. Her fashion set trends across Europe. Her photographs hung in homes like family portraits. And yet, behind the pearls and posture, she drifted further and further into a narcotic fog that no one dared name aloud. Alexandra was, by all accounts, a devoted queen and wife, in public. In private, she was a woman suffering from chronic pain, increasing deafness, and a long, slow retreat into silence. By the time she entered her 60s, she was nearly stone deaf from a childhood ear infection that worsened over decades. She masked it well, reading lips with uncanny precision, smiling at jokes she couldn't hear, nodding through parliamentary addresses like she'd caught every word. But the cost of keeping up appearances was staggering. She didn't just fake it, she medicated it. By the early 1900s, Alexandra was regularly using morphine, opium-based tinctures, and other Victorian-era sedatives. Initially, they were prescribed for pain, physical and emotional. The chronic ear problems were debilitating, but equally painful, perhaps, was the steady withdrawal of attention. Her husband was a serial philanderer. Her son grew into a cold and distant king, and the royal court, once her stage, slowly evolved into a place where she no longer quite belonged. Doctors of the time weren't subtle. The default prescription for any upper-class woman suffering from nervous strain, female complaints, or what they diplomatically called a grief of the nerves was morphine. It was offered as casually as tea, and Alexandra, always the good patient, took her doses without complaint. As the years wore on, her use became dependency. She grew frailer, thinner. Reports from household staff described her sleeping at odd hours, cancelling engagements last minute, or sitting motionless for hours in her favourite chair, her hands folded as if posing for a portrait no one was painting. Yet her public image remained immaculate. The British press, respectful of royalty to the point of delusion, never reported on her condition. To the outside world, she was still the Queen Mother, still beloved, still gracefully aloof. And that's the unsettling part. The same nation that once devoured rumours about Edward VII's dinner parties now politely ignored Alexandra's descent into chemical sedation. Was it compassion or just discomfort? The British monarchy has always known how to erase the unseemly through silence, ceremony, or well-timed obituaries. Alexandra's addiction wasn't a scandal because no one was willing to admit it existed. When she died in 1925, tributes poured in. The nation mourns a second mother, one headline read. And perhaps it was true, but Alexandra's real story, the quiet pain, the pills, the withdrawal from a world she could no longer hear, was buried long before her body ever was. And yet, she wasn't alone in her quiet exile. In Sweden, a very different kind of royal was drinking not out of sorrow, but rage. A king exiled not just from power, but from his own sense of self. 8. King Gustav IV, Adolf of Sweden. He was born under a crown and died under a false name. Gustav IV Adolf of Sweden didn't just lose his throne, he lost the story that had been written for him. And somewhere along that long, humiliating descent from monarch to exile, he found his own method of forgetting, the bottle. When Gustav came to power in 1792, he inherited a kingdom caught between war-shifting alliances and the aftershocks of the French Revolution. His response was idealistic to the point of delusion. A devout conservative, Gustav positioned himself as a holy warrior against Napoleon, refusing to make peace even when every strategic map said otherwise. He believed his mission was sacred. The problem was, no one else did. By 1809, he was overthrown in a bloodless coup, not by enemies but by his own court. The military had lost faith, the nobles were exhausted, and the people had had enough of piety over pragmatism. Gustav abdicated under pressure and was promptly exiled. And here is where the story turns from political to personal, because what followed was not a noble retirement or quiet dignity. It was slow decay, made bearable only by drink. In exile, Gustav took on the name Colonel Gustafsson. Gone were the royal palaces, the military parades, the diplomatic audiences. He wandered through Europe, sometimes staying in boarding houses, sometimes begging favors from distant relatives, often drinking himself into a haze. Reports from people who encountered him during these years describe a man unrecognizable from his royal portraits, disheveled, morose, quick-tempered, and reeking of fortified wine. Alcohol became his anchor and his eraser. In it, he could dissolve not only his shame, but also his memories. Because, unlike other deposed monarchs who clung to the illusion of return, Gustav seemed to accept grimly that he was never going home. That knowledge broke something in him. He drank not to rebel, but to retreat. His letters from exile, fewer and more erratic as the years went on, contained long passages of confusion and circular reasoning. He fixated on imagined slights, on divine punishment, on redemption that never came. His health deteriorated quickly. His moods were volatile. Servants came and went. Few stayed long. It was, in every sense, a royal tragedy, but a quiet one, away from cameras, scandals, or fanfare. He died in 1837, alone in Switzerland, buried under a pseudonym. No state funeral, no royal procession, just a forgotten king with a bottle-shaped hole in his legacy. And still, Gustav's story wasn't entirely unique. In fact, it was starting to look like a pattern. Royals born into power who couldn't survive without it, and who turned to drink as both protest and anesthesia. But some kings didn't need exile to unravel. They brought the excess with them into every room, every feast, every dawn. Take one Henry VIII, a man who treated his body like a battlefield and his goblet like a weapon. 9. King Henry VIII of England. When it came to appetites, King Henry VIII never believed in moderation. His hunger for power, for legacy, for admiration, for wives, and yes, for food and drink, consumed not just his court, but his very body. Most people remember him for the marital carnage and theological upheaval. Fewer dwell on the fact that Henry drank almost constantly, using wine as his hydration and ale as his breakfast juice. It wasn't scandalous in his time, it was cultural. 16th century England didn't trust water. Rivers doubled as latrines, and aqueducts were full of God knows what. Wine, ale, mead, and small beer weren't just for merriment, they were survival tools. Even children drank weak ale. But where the average Tudor subject consumed out of necessity, Henry turned it into ritual. He began his days with ale accompanied by roasted meats and spiced bread. As the sun climbed, so did the strength of his drink. Midday feasts involved flagons of Bordeaux and tankards of sack, a fortified white wine. By evening, the goblets were full of spiced claret, and the king, often groaning from a leg ulcer or gout flare, was pressing physicians for stronger cordials to stimulate the humours. These were often infused with herbs, opium, and more alcohol. This wasn't indulgence, it was policy. Henry drank as he ruled, expansively, erratically, and with absolute conviction. His court followed suit, knowing that to toast without enthusiasm was to risk disfavour. Records show that the royal cellar housed over 600,000 gallons of wine across his reign. Guests to Hampton Court were served according to rank. The higher your title, the stronger your pour. Naturally, Henry's was the strongest of all, but the drink served another function, subtler and more revealing. It dulled things. Pain, for one. By his 40s, Henry's health was collapsing. His once athletic frame ballooned into obesity. He suffered from migraines, insomnia, ulcers, joint pain, and the slow rot of diabetes. Physicians could do little but offer poultices and potions, most of which were just alcohol wearing a medical disguise. Then there was the deeper pain, paranoia, disappointment, legacy anxiety. Henry had broken from Rome to create a New England, and yet he remained haunted by the absence of sons, the instability of his marriages, and the creeping suspicion that he might be remembered more for his appetites than his achievements. Alcohol made it easier to sleep, or at least to stop thinking. He was not considered a drunk by his contemporaries, but he was unmistakably dependent. Not slurring or staggering, just always with a goblet, always sipping, always a little removed from the sharp edges of reality. His moods were unpredictable, his decisions more volatile after long banquets, his speeches increasingly rambling. Court chroniclers learned to distinguish between early-day Henry and late feast Henry. When he died in 1547, the empire he'd built was splintered, unsure of its future. The man himself had become a kind of immovable force, swollen, pained, and in the end, entirely human beneath the armour. But if Henry drank to dull a crumbling body, the next royal drank to numb a restless spirit, one whose beauty, loneliness, and obsession with control led her not to the goblet alone, but to an entire chemist's cabinet of dreams. 10. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi. She was a legend in her own lifetime, the tragic beauty of the Habsburg court, the restless soul trapped in brocade and gold. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to the world as Sisi, seemed to exist outside the rules of monarchy and womanhood alike. She travelled compulsively, fasted obsessively, and avoided court life with the precision of a seasoned escape artist. But beneath the iconic waistline and cascade of chestnut hair was a woman who relied increasingly on drugs and alcohol to steady her nerves, soothe her sorrows, and stay one step ahead of herself. From her earliest days at the Viennese court, Cece chafed against the suffocating rituals of imperial life. She was a Bavarian duchess by birth, outdoorsy, unfiltered, allergic to politics, and she never adapted to the cold formality of the Habsburg palace. Her mother-in-law, the iron-fisted Archduchess Sophie, tried to turn her into a proper empress. Cece, in response, turned to tonics. First came the beauty elixirs. These were expensive cosmetic concoctions, laced with alcohol, ether, and even cocaine derivatives, all perfectly legal and enthusiastically marketed to women seeking eternal youth. Cece, obsessed with her appearance, drank these mixtures religiously, but they weren't just vanity drinks. They calmed her nerves, suppressed her appetite, and gave her the energy to endure long stretches of ceremonial duty without breaking. Later, as her mental health declined and her wanderlust intensified, Cece expanded her pharmacological toolkit. Morphine, laudanum, chloroform drops, all prescribed in doses that blurred the line between relief and retreat. She described herself as perpetually anxious, unable to sleep, incapable of silence. Letters from her physicians and attendants suggest that she rarely faced a day unmedicated. Alcohol, too, played its part, not in benders or royal feasts, but in the quiet hours. Champagne for her nerves, wine with her herbal sleeping draughts. Like so many aristocrats of her era, she masked her dependency as refinement. A flute of Veuve Clicquot with breakfast didn't raise eyebrows when the woman drinking it was an empress. And yet, Cece was never quite at peace. Her life was marked by intense grief, the death of her daughter, the suicide of her son, and a marriage that became increasingly ceremonial. Her body remained a battlefield. She starved herself to maintain her impossibly narrow waist. She subjected herself to punishing beauty routines, including hours of hair brushing and ice baths. The drugs and alcohol allowed her to maintain the performance, to appear ethereal and untouchable. But they also isolated her. She spent more time in hotel rooms than palaces, more time writing melancholic poetry than giving royal speeches. Her addiction wasn't explosive, it was slow and sorrowful, a quiet descent into chemical solitude. She was a ghost in her own lifetime, mourned even as she still walked the halls of her empire. And though her end came violently, her drift into chemical detachment had started long before. She didn't vanish all at once. She faded through powders, potions, and crystal flutes. The next king, however, didn't fade quietly. He built a world of fantasy around himself, then drowned in the very illusions meant to protect him. 11. King Ludwig II of Bavaria. They called him the Swan King, a monarch who built castles that looked like dreams and lived in one that felt like a nightmare. King Ludwig II of Bavaria was a man consumed by beauty, so much so that he built his entire reign around escaping reality. But when imagination becomes habit and isolation becomes identity, the line between artist and addict blurs into something tragic. Ludwig's addictions weren't limited to substances, they were to fantasy itself, yet in his final years the substances caught up. Chloroform, sedatives, and the sweet, suffocating numbness of chemical calm. He was crowned in 1864 at the age of 18, shy, romantic, almost allergic to the mechanics of governance. Where other rulers saw ministers and armies, Ludwig saw landscapes and orchestras. He idolized Richard Wagner, sponsoring the composer to the brink of financial ruin and scandal. Bavaria's parliament wanted a leader. They got a dreamer. At first, the eccentricity was charming. Ludwig rode alone through mountain forests at night, speaking to the moon as if it were his equal. He commissioned grand palaces that would one day become postcards. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee. each an increasingly elaborate monument to his refusal to live in the world as it was. But behind the fairy tale architecture and candlelit solitude, the king's mind began to crack. Physicians of the court noted bouts of paranoia, insomnia, and melancholic delirium. His journals reveal guilt, loneliness, and a mind that would not rest. To quiet it, his doctors prescribed the standard 19th century remedy: sedation, first opium tinctures, then chloral hydrate, and finally chloroform itself, a powerful anesthetic used to subdue the nervous and the hysterical. Ludwig became increasingly reliant on these treatments, his nights turning into long, drugged retreats from daylight. The more he medicated, the less he governed. Bavaria fell into administrative chaos, while the king disappeared into his castles. Servants spoke of him as if he were already dead, a ghost wandering through candlelit corridors, half asleep and murmuring Wagnerian lines. Ministers worried, then panicked. When the bills for his architectural fantasies piled up, they moved to have him declared insane. In June 1886, doctors arrived at Neuschwanstein with papers of deposition. Ludwig was formally deposed on grounds of paranoid madness, though the diagnosis was conveniently political. He was escorted to Berg Castle under supervision. His last days were marked by confusion, sedation, and small flickers of awareness, just enough to know he had been betrayed. Then came the mystery. One evening, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg alongside his physician. The official report claimed drowning. The unofficial whispers suggested something else. No autopsy was ever properly done. What remains is a haunting image, a king who built castles to escape the real world, only to vanish into the dark waters beneath them. His death was poetic, perhaps even inevitable, an emperor of illusion undone by the one thing he couldn't construct: peace. And if Ludwig tried to flee reality through dreams, the next monarch ran headlong into it, his nights fueled not by visions or waltzes, but by opium, cards, and scandalous excess in a kingdom already falling apart. 12. King Farouk Wang of Egypt. There are monarchs who try to rule history, and there are monarchs who become cautionary tales within it. King Farouk I of Egypt belonged squarely to the latter. By the time he fled Cairo in 1952, suitcase in one hand, exile papers in the other, he had already drowned his crown in champagne, opium, and a long parade of self-inflicted humiliation. Farouk didn't just struggle with addiction. He wrapped it in luxury, dressed it in silk, and turned it into performance. He ascended the throne in 1936 at the age of 16, youthful, idealized, and utterly unprepared. Egypt hoped he might usher in a new era, a modernizer, a bridge between tradition and reform. What they got was a teenager handed a kingdom and a bottomless bank account. Farouk responded the way most teenagers might, by overindulging, first with sweets, then with women, then with drink, and finally with drugs. By his 20s, his excesses were legendary. He was already deeply addicted to sleeping pills, amphetamine cocktails, and opium-based tonics, not as occasional vices, but as daily survival tools. Farouk suffered from chronic insomnia, anxiety, and mood swings, and his handlers medicated him in accordance with the logic of the time: overprescribe, overmedicate, and hope he smiles in public. He did, occasionally, but more often he was seen stumbling through state events, forgetting names, slurring announcements, and whispering paranoid suspicions to aides, no longer sure whether he remembered who they were. His court became a carousel of sycophants, foreign hangers-on, and physicians willing to supply nerve tonics in exchange for royal favor. Alcohol, which had once been a social indulgence, became routine. His private parties at Abdeen Palace and on his yacht Marusa were exercises in gluttony. Multi-course meals, flowing liquor, casino tables, and drug use thinly veiled as aristocratic eccentricity. One Italian socialite recalled Farouk as the only man who could fall asleep mid-conversation while holding a cigar and not drop it. But Egypt was watching. The people who once admired their youthful monarch began to turn. Farouk's weight tripled, his security paranoia deepened, corruption flourished, political instability worsened, and yet the palace windows stayed shut, the dining halls stayed loud, and the opium bottles stayed full. In 1952, the Free Officers movement staged a coup. Farouk, bloated and confused, was escorted onto his yacht and sent into exile. He left behind a crumbling monarchy and a population that had long since stopped toasting his name. His last years were spent in Italy, in cafes and casinos, still medicated, still eating excessively, still drinking as though the party hadn't ended decades earlier. He died in 1965 of a heart attack at dinner, reportedly during dessert. Some say it was the foie gras, others suspect the pills. But the truth is, Farouk died the way he had ruled, overindulged, overmedicated, and overlooked. But while Farouk's descent was theatrical, the next monarch's intoxication was quieter. Cloaked in lace and laughter, slipping beneath the radar as her husband fell into disgrace and she reached for chemical comfort in exile. 13. King Charles II of England. If ever there was a monarch who seemed to enjoy ruling as much as he enjoyed drinking, it was Charles II of England. The Merry Monarch, as he was known, affectionately by some, derisively by others, didn't just preside over Restoration England. He revelled in it. His reign was a 25-year-long after-party to a decade of Puritan repression. Cromwell was dead. The theatres reopened, and Charles stepped onto the throne with a goblet in one hand, a mistress in the other, and a court that ran more like a cabaret. But the revelry was not as harmless as it appeared. Behind the polished charm, behind the court masks and glittering banquets, Charles had a relationship with drink and with drugs that was far more than ceremonial. He used them to keep pace with his own persona, to keep the energy going, to keep the throne festive even when the kingdom around him teetered on instability. Charles returned from exile in 1660 with a continental flair and a taste for the French approach to living well, which meant, above all else, living soft. Wine was a staple, strong cordials and herbal liqueurs were health aids, and if something stronger was required to stay alert during long nights of performance, political or otherwise, opium-based tonics could be conveniently labelled as restoratives. The line between medicinal and recreational was never enforced in Restoration England. Charles's physicians were instructed to keep him upright and energized, even if that meant flooding his system with all manner of chemical concoctions. Some of these were mixed by the king himself. He had a passion for alchemy and dabbling in early chemistry, which is to say, he experimented with various elixirs of uncertain origin, combining alcohol with powdered herbs, minerals, and narcotics under the guise of royal science. The court reflected his habits. Foreign ambassadors wrote home with thinly veiled disbelief at the amount of drinking that went on at Whitehall. Dinners lasted for hours. Toasts were endless. Courtiers learned to measure their status by how close they were seated to the wine casks. But Charles was no sloppy drunk. He remained coherent, charming and disturbingly sharp through it all. That was the secret. He functioned, but functioning is not the same as thriving. By the mid-1670s, Charles was exhausted. His nights grew longer, his attention shorter. Reports describe a man who would retreat from council meetings only to emerge hours later with pupils dilated and speech sped up, offering sudden bursts of energy followed by lethargy. The drugs that once kept him nimble had started to wear him down, and yet, despite the physical toll, he refused to slow. His identity, as monarch, as man, as myth, was entangled in indulgence. When plague struck, when fire tore through London, when Parliament turned hostile, Charles still hosted lavish suppers, still smiled through the wine. Hayes still presented himself as the affable anchor holding England together through sheer charm. He died suddenly in 1685 after suffering a stroke, leaving behind a kingdom both more vibrant and more cynical than he had found it. On his deathbed, he famously apologized for taking such a long time to die. It was perhaps his last joke, or his final admission that the party had gone on longer than it should have. But where Charles masked crisis in comedy, the next king on our list faced it with brooding silence, drinking not to entertain a court, but to forget the weight of an empire slipping through his fingers. 14. Queen Caroline of Brunswick. If royal history had a tragicomic genre, Queen Caroline of Brunswick would be its headlining act. She was loud when expected to be quiet, defiant when demanded to be docile, and eventually intoxicated when the silence of exile became too heavy to bear. Her life was a cascade of embarrassments, injustices, and palace whispers, and her descent into alcohol was not so much scandalous as it was inevitable. Caroline married her first cousin, George IV, then Prince of Wales, in what might be one of history's most mutually regrettable unions. He despised her from the moment she arrived in England. She found him bloated, petulant, and frequently drunk. He found her unfashionable, unpolished, and baikiki, in his own words, unbearable. On their wedding night, he reportedly drank himself unconscious. The marriage produced a single child, and then collapsed entirely. What followed was not a quiet royal separation, but a public circus. George lavished mistresses with gifts and attention while attempting unsuccessfully to erase Caroline from public life. She, in turn, gave the British press something far more thrilling than statecraft, a jilted queen who refused to disappear. And yet the exile did come. Caroline left England, roaming through Europe in a kind of self-imposed scandal-tinged tour of courts and villas, pursued not by admirers, but by spies and rumours. It was during this exile that alcohol became a fixture in her life. Sources from the time describe her erratic behaviour in increasingly consistent terms: loud, dishevelled, emotionally volatile, and often visibly drunk. Servants recounted episodes of weeping at odd hours, talking to herself in half-English, half-German fragments, and offering guests generous pours of wine at breakfast. There are stories, some embellished, others disturbingly plausible, of her appearing barefoot at dinner parties or singing folk songs long after everyone else had gone to bed. It wasn't that she drank because she didn't care, it was that she cared too much and had nowhere to place it. Her daughter, Princess Charlotte, died young. Her husband tried to divorce her publicly through Parliament. The British elite mocked her relentlessly, and yet, through it all, she refused to vanish. Alcohol, in her case, was both shield and sword. It dulled the heartbreak and gave her the boldness to continue performing the role of queen, long after the title had been stripped of meaning. In 1820, when George IV finally became king, Caroline returned to England to claim her place as queen consort, or at least to provoke a reckoning. What she received instead was a spectacle, blocked from the coronation, booed in the House of Lords, and subjected to a humiliating trial alleging adultery and moral indecency. The outcome was inconclusive, but her reputation and health never recovered. She died the following year, reportedly ill and exhausted, but not without one last flash of defiance. Her funeral carriage was rerouted against government orders, her loyalists clashing with soldiers in the street. Caroline was a woman undone by a crown she never truly wore, but whose story refused to be footnoted. And just like her, the next monarch drank not to escape disgrace, but to survive the slow collapse of an empire he was sworn to defend. 15. King Philip IV of Spain. In the dim corridors of the Escorial Palace, lit by oil lamps and cloaked in incense, King Philip IV of Spain presided not so much as a ruler, but as a relic, draped in ritual, suffocated by devotion, and slowly dissolving into his goblet. His court was austere, but his private world, far from it. Behind the polished walls of Spain's golden age lingered a monarch deeply fatigued by war, bureaucracy, and the burden of holding an empire together with failing hands. And through it all, there was wine. There were cordials, there were calming concoctions whispered into goblets by confessors who believed that piety and sedation weren't necessarily enemies. Philip's relationship with alcohol was rooted in exhaustion. His reign stretched nearly 45 years, from 1621 to 1665, and for most of that time, Spain was on fire. Wars raged in the Netherlands. The economy crumbled under imperial overreach. Plague and famine cycled through his dominions like seasons. At court, he was surrounded by sycophants and theologians, all offering divine explanations for worldly failure. Philip drank to make the sermons stop echoing. Unlike the flamboyant revelers of other courts, Philip's drinking took on a quieter, more sorrowful form. He was a man of structure, daily mass, elaborate schedules, unending paperwork. But as the years wore on, his routine blurred. Royal physicians began prescribing fortified wines and herbal tinctures to strengthen the constitution. These weren't harmless tonics. Many were infused with alcohol, sedative herbs, and early opiate derivatives meant to soften the melancholic spirit and help sleep find its way past guilt. Because guilt was Philip's shadow. He had presided over the decline of what had once been the most powerful empire in the world. The armada was gone, the coffers were empty, territories were slipping away like sand. Even his personal life echoed the collapse. His wife Isabella died young, and his children followed one by one in a grim procession. By the end, only a sickly heir remained, and Philip was haunted by the knowledge that the boy would inherit little more than debts and expectations. Confessors advised more prayer. Court doctors advised more rest. Philip nodded politely and poured another cup. He took his religious obligations seriously, perhaps even obsessively. But even saints, it seems, sometimes needed something stronger than scripture. Wine became his quiet companion, not raucous or reckless, but ever present. At banquets, he drank little in public. In private, however, the cellars of the Escorial were rarely untouched. His later portraits show a gaunt man with heavy eyes, lost in thought, or perhaps in memory. He no longer attended as many councils. Letters grew shorter, instructions vaguer. The king, for all his rituals, was drifting. Even Velázquez, his court painter, captured this slowness, the way Philip seemed to be not looking at the viewer, but through them. He died in 1665, leaving behind an empire in retreat and a son who would become Charles II, a monarch so ill-fated that some believed the dynasty itself had cursed blood. But long before that final unravelling, Philip IV was already numbing his conscience with communion and claret, a sovereign who tried to rule the world but couldn't rule the silence of his own chambers. And yet, when grief gets deeper than duty, and the night grows heavier than the crown, even the strongest king sometimes reaches for stronger spirits. As did another royal grieving his queen, with only laudanum and brandy to keep the fog from closing in. 16. King Leopold I of Belgium. He was called the King Founder, the architect of modern Belgium, a monarch chosen, not born, who carved out a legacy of cautious diplomacy, rigid moralism, and stifling personal grief. King Leopold I wore his dignity like armor. Stoic, formal, and precise, he appeared in public as the very image of constitutional order. But behind the ironed uniforms and calculated neutrality was a man quietly unraveling, mourning a dead wife, grieving a dead son, and reaching, more often than he admitted, for a glass of brandy laced with laudanum to carry him through the hours. Leopold was no libertine. His habits were not wild or theatrical. He did not stagger through palaces or host scandalous suppers. His addictions were quieter, ceremonial, almost clinical, wrapped in etiquette, hidden under the veil of medicinal necessity, which in many ways made them easier to ignore, but not less real. The root of his reliance wasn't indulgence, it was sorrow. In 1840, Leopold's beloved wife, Louise Marie of Orléans, died of tuberculosis. The loss devastated him. Letters from this period reveal a man spiraling inward. He wrote of the black fog that entered his rooms at dusk, of the strange silence that pressed against his chest, of needing something warm to soothe the hollow ache that medicine could not name. That something warm usually arrived in a small bottle with a physician's signature. Laudanum, a popular opium tincture of the time, was prescribed to Leopold not only for sleep, but for what his doctors vaguely called constitutional melancholy. It dulled the edges of his insomnia, calmed the tightness in his chest, and kept his hands from shaking during long diplomatic sessions. Paired with brandy, she drank slowly, methodically. It created a twilight state where grief felt distant enough to manage. No one called it addiction. The word didn't quite exist in the way we understand it now, but even his closest advisors noticed the change. His temper, once cool and exacting, became more erratic. He'd fall into long silences mid-conversation. He cancelled audiences without explanation, citing vague illnesses. His journal entries shifted in tone, from the clipped efficiency of a ruler to the foggy, fragmented reflections of a man trying to reason with ghosts. Yet he kept up appearances. Always the monarch, always composed. Diplomats praised his statesmanship, his restraint, his princely intellect, and he was those things. He was also a man who, more often than not, needed chemical help to face breakfast. When he died in 1865, the nation mourned a founder. Streets were renamed, monuments erected, but the man himself had already been drifting away for years, anesthetized by grief, numbed by tinctures, and haunted by a kingdom he built but never quite lived inside. And while Leopold drank to escape the ghosts of his own palace, another emperor, one far to the east, drank to summon them, to challenge them, and sometimes just to outlast them in sheer ferocious excess. 17. Emperor Peter the Great of Russia. Peter the Great didn't drink. He conquered alcohol the way he conquered everything else, with unrelenting force, spectacular chaos, and a total disregard for moderation. He didn't sip vodka, he declared war on it, only to lose the battle with theatrical consistency. For Peter, drinking wasn't a vice or a crutch. It was a ritual, a performance, a national sport, and he always made sure to win, or at least go down louder than anyone else. Born in 1672, Peter inherited a fractured Russia and turned it into an empire. He built cities, modernized the army, created a navy out of nothing, and yanked the country, screaming, from medievalism into something resembling modern Europe. But for all his vision, all his intelligence and ruthlessness, Peter remained deeply, almost cartoonishly, committed to drinking as a way of life. More than that, as a governing principle. His drinking bouts were not private affairs. They were events, lavish, punishing spectacles involving fountains of brandy, tables groaning with smoked meats and pickles, and guests, diplomatic and otherwise, who often had to be carried out. Ambassadors wrote home with astonished horror at the expectation that they match the Tsar drink for drink, hour after hour, well into the frozen dawn. Peter's favourite creation, the all-joking, all-drunken synod of fools and jesters, was essentially a parody church he invented as an excuse for elaborate drinking rituals, complete with mock sermons, drunken processions, and faux cardinals who administered vodka as communion. This wasn't a side hobby, it was a cultural institution, and Peter, of course, was both pope and prophet of the madness. But for all the laughs, there was something darker underneath. Peter's drinking wasn't just celebratory, it was deeply compulsive. He drank before meetings, during campaigns, after floggings, following executions, in grief, in victory, in boredom. It numbed his migraines, it silenced his nerves, it fueled his famously violent outbursts. Contemporaries noted a disturbing transformation when Peter drank. The brilliant reformer became unpredictable, sometimes jovial, sometimes sadistic. He would laugh hysterically at things no one else found funny, then fly into terrifying rages. He once forced a man to drink himself to death as punishment, then toasted the corpse. Another time, he had courtiers baptized in barrels of wine until they vomited, passed out, or both. And the drinking took a toll. By his later years, Peter's health was deteriorating. He suffered from urinary tract infections, kidney problems, seizures, and what we would now call chronic alcohol-related damage. Still, he refused to scale back. One court observer described him as never entirely sober, yet always fully in command, or so he believed. Peter died in 1725 at the age of 52, likely from complications related to his health and drinking combined. But even in death, the legend remained of an emperor who built an empire with one hand and lifted a vodka bottle with the other. And while Peter drank to shape a new world, the next queen on our list used wine to retreat from the old one, locked away, half forgotten, sipping her memories under watchful eyes and the weight of a crown she'd already lost. 18. Queen Mary of Scots. She ruled 3 kingdoms, lost 2, and spent nearly 20 years locked away in the 3rd. Queen Mary of Scots was a sovereign born into crisis, matured in exile and undone by the very crowns she was meant to wear. And in the dim chambers of her final years, imprisoned in a series of damp English castles under the wary eye of her cousin Elizabeth I, Mary turned to what little comfort was still available to her: strong French wine and a quiet succession of medicinal opiates to dull both pain and memory. Mary's story was already a tragedy before the first cork was pulled. She had been Queen of Scotland since infancy, Queen Consort of France before the age of 17, and a widow before her 18th birthday. Political pressures drove her back to Scotland, where her reign quickly unravelled into scandal, rebellion, and forced abdication. By 25, she was a fugitive. By 26, a captive in England, and she would remain one, a prisoner, for the next 19 years. Her early confinement was relatively genteel. She was kept in noble houses with servants, tapestries, books, and an allowance. But freedom was out of reach, and the walls closed in slowly. Over time, the conditions hardened. Her rooms shrank, her household was reduced, and her body, worn from stress and decades of childbearing, began to suffer. That's when the remedies began. Royal physicians supplied her with the standard pharmacological toolkit of the 16th century: poppy tinctures, herbal sedatives, spiced cordials. These concoctions were ostensibly prescribed for insomnia, joint pain, and female discomfort. In reality, they offered the only relief available to a once great queen, reduced to pacing the same cold floors year after year. Wine, too, became a daily necessity. It was safer than water, of course, but for Mary, it was also emotional insulation. French by upbringing, she favoured claret and sweet white wines imported from Bordeaux. Letters from her captors mention her increasing reliance on drink, especially in the later years at Fotheringhay Castle, when the shadow of execution grew longer. The combination of wine and sedatives left her at times drowsy, withdrawn, and erratic. Guards noted her melancholy, her habit of speaking softly to herself, and her tendency to drift off mid-sentence. Yet she remained defiant, still writing letters, still plotting, still signing her name as Marie R., as if the crown had never been stripped away. Her final months were marked by intensified surveillance and declining health. Whether from the cumulative effects of stress, confinement, or addiction, she was reportedly thin, pale, and physically frail. But mentally she endured, holding fast to her identity, her Catholic faith, and her belief that her suffering had a purpose. In 1587, she was executed. It was swift, theatrical, and, by design, humiliating. Yet even as she faced death, Mary maintained composure, requesting wine before her final act, as though to toast the woman she had once been. And if Mary drank to soften a fading world, the next king embraced opiates not as escape, but as prescription. A ruler treated into dysfunction, whose own mind was blurred by the very drugs meant to keep him sane. 19. King Frederick William IV of Prussia, known in his youth as the Romantic on the throne, King Frederick William IV of Prussia was a ruler who dreamed in Gothic cathedrals, sketched palaces in his diary margins, and quoted poetry in state letters. But by the end of his life, those dreams had dissolved into fog. His mind unraveled slowly, then all at once, and the doctors, as they often did in the 19th century, turned to the nearest chemical solution. First opium, then morphine, then more of both, until the king himself became more tranquilized than sovereign. Frederick William came to the throne in 1840 with grand artistic visions and a deeply religious soul. He was intellectually gifted, idealistic, and temperamentally unsuited for the age of revolutions. He preferred frescoes to firearms, sacred architecture to statecraft, and long walks in silence to parliamentary debate. But the world outside didn't care for poetry. In 1848, revolutions erupted across Europe, and Frederick William was forced into action. He fumbled, first offering concessions, then rescinding them, then offering crowns and refusing others. His vacillation cost him credibility. The liberals didn't trust him. The conservatives barely tolerated him, and he, caught between worlds, began to crack. The pressure exposed a pre-existing fragility. Insomnia set in, headaches became constant. Panic attacks, described in his letters as divine torment, began to surface in the early 1850s. Enter the doctors, and with them, the bottles. Opium, prescribed for both sleep and emotional agitation, became a staple of the king's daily life. Initially administered in tincture form, it soon escalated to morphine injections, a newer and more potent alternative. The drugs dulled the anxiety, but they also dulled everything else. His speech grew slower, his moods turned unpredictable. He would wander the halls of Sanssouci Palace at odd hours, reciting prayers or standing in silence, unable to explain why he had come or what he was thinking. By 1858, Frederick William was declared mentally unfit to rule. A regency was established under his brother, the future Wilhelm I, and the romantic king faded into the wallpaper. He was not deposed exactly, just gently put aside, still king in title, but no longer in charge of anything except his own disintegrating mind. In his final years, he was kept under soft supervision, surrounded by religious texts, fading sketches, and the persistent whisper of morphine. Occasionally he would rally, delivering grand, disconnected monologues about cathedrals or divine right, before slipping back into silence. He died in 1861, a decade after his mind had already left the throne. Frederick William's reign began with stained glass and ended in blurred vision. His addiction wasn't rebellion, it wasn't decadence, it was medical, quiet, and tragic, the kind that creeps in through the hands of people trying to help. But the next royal on our list was less forgotten, and far more infamous. A prince who traded royal etiquette for scandal, morphine, and public disgrace, until even his own empire tried to write him out of the picture. 20. Archduke Ludwig Victor of Austria. In the long, buttoned-up corridors of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, few caused more raised eyebrows or rolled eyes than Archduke Ludwig Victor. The youngest brother of Emperor Franz Joseph, Ludwig Victor was not destined for a throne, but for ornamentation, a minor royal with a grand title and no clear function. And like many ornamental things, he cracked under the weight of being looked at without being listened to. While most royals concealed their vices under layers of courtly performance, Ludwig Victor became infamous for his flamboyant disregard. He was a man who drifted through society salons and scandal sheets in equal measure, indulging not just in luxury, but in public displays of it. Vienna's elites knew him as eccentric. The imperial court knew him as a problem. And increasingly he became known and avoided for his escalating dependency on alcohol and morphine. At first, it was written off as harmless decadence. Ludwig Victor had always been a peacock among soldiers. He wore bright colors, threw elaborate parties, and collected art and admirers in large numbers. He was considered too unserious for politics, too delicate for the military, and too unpredictable for diplomatic work. So he was politely sidelined. No titles, no offices, just a generous allowance and an unspoken request to stay out of the way. That request went unanswered. By his 40s, Ludwig Victor had become a public embarrassment to the Habsburg dynasty. Rumors swirled of drunken episodes in Vienna theaters, impromptu performances at private clubs, and increasingly bizarre behavior at social events. But what disturbed the court more than the theater was the medicine. He had begun using morphine regularly, at first for nerves, then for migraines, and eventually for what attendants described as long spells of aimless agitation. Physicians attempted to manage the problem discreetly. Morphine was still considered a medical solution, not a social threat. But Ludwig Victor's usage didn't stay private. He carried vials with him, administered injections in front of staff, and joked about his elixirs in polite company. The combination of heavy alcohol use and morphine left him visibly altered, erratic in speech, unpredictable in mood, and at times unrecognizable from the spirited young man who once danced through Vienna's winter balls. The court finally intervened after a public incident at a bathhouse, a scandal that made headlines across Europe and could no longer be laughed off. He was quietly exiled to Schloss Klesheim, a palace near Salzburg, where he lived out the rest of his life under a sort of genteel house arrest. There, surrounded by empty wine bottles, fading portraits, and staff under strict instructions to keep the peace, Ludwig Victor grew increasingly isolated. Letters from this period reveal slurred handwriting, erratic thoughts, and a growing sense of bitterness toward a family and a world that had moved on without him. He died in 1919, mostly forgotten, overshadowed by the collapse of the empire his brother had tried to hold together. Ludwig Victor wasn't mourned as a statesman or a patriot. He was remembered, if at all, as the royal who wouldn't behave, a cautionary footnote in the long, tragic novel of Habsburg decline. But the next monarch didn't fall amid velvet and scandal. He unraveled in exile, his loneliness drowned not in theatre but in silence, and in the quiet company of a drink poured for no one but himself. 21. King Haakon VII of Norway. Among the ranks of troubled royals, King Haakon VII of Norway doesn't quite fit the mould. He wasn't a libertine, he wasn't decadent, he didn't vanish into scandal or collapse beneath the weight of a crown too heavy for his character. In fact, to most of the world, he was a war hero, a symbol of resistance, dignity, and national unity during one of Europe's darkest chapters. But even symbols crack under pressure, and Haakon, for all his quiet strength, cracked in private, in exile and, as some of his later writings suggest, with a bottle by his side. Born Prince Karl of Denmark, Haakon became the first king of independent Norway in 1905. It was a symbolic position at first, largely ceremonial, until it wasn't. In 1940, as Nazi Germany invaded, Haakon was forced to flee. Refusing to surrender or become a puppet monarch, he escaped to Britain, where he spent the next 5 years as a king without a kingdom, leading the resistance in absentia. To the public, he was stoic, delivering radio addresses full of strength and calm, wearing his military uniform with a somber kind of gravity. Norwegian citizens hung his photograph in their homes like an icon. He was not just their monarch, he was their stand-in for home. But exile is rarely noble in practice. It is lonely, repetitive, and corrosive. For Haakon, it meant long nights in a borrowed palace, endless meetings with diplomats, writing letters that couldn't change the war, and receiving dispatches of suffering from a homeland he couldn't help. His wartime diaries, though formal in tone, begin to show hints of emotional wear, references to the weight of silence, to restless thoughts, and to sleepless nights that became routine. Those close to him noted that during the London years, Haakon drank more than before, mostly alone, mostly quietly. Whiskey, brandy, occasionally aquavit sent from sympathizers. Not drunkenness exactly, not celebration, but a slow, steady reliance, a habit not of indulgence, but of endurance. It wasn't talked about. The royal family didn't address it. Biographers often step around it politely, calling it a private coping mechanism. But servants and aides left memoirs that mention his late-night pacing, his long silences at breakfast, and the familiar clink of a decanter being put away before the morning briefing. After the war, Håkon returned to Norway to a hero's welcome. But something in him had shifted. He was more reserved, more solemn, less eager to take the stage. He served as king until his death in 1957, always dignified, always steady, but privately haunted by years spent away from his people, from his land, and perhaps from his own sense of purpose. His story is a reminder that not all addictions announce themselves with scandal or ruin. Some are quiet, measured, hidden in plain sight, not because the person has something to hide, but because they're too dignified to ask for help. And while Håkon drank to carry the weight of a fractured kingdom, the next royal's drinking came not from war, but from power unchecked and a temper soaked in fortified wine that sometimes made kings act like tyrants. 22. King Sigismund III of Poland. In portraits, he appears every inch the Catholic monarch, draped in furs and jewels, holding a scepter with the solemn stare of someone posing for eternity. King Sigismund III, Vasa, ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and briefly of Sweden, saw himself not just as a king, but as God's appointed vessel on earth. His court was steeped in ritual, grandeur, incense and war. But behind the pious exterior and the stiff brocade was a man increasingly known for his mood swings, outbursts, and an escalating habit of drinking that left even his closest advisors wondering who or what was really making decisions. Born into the royal Vasa family of Sweden, Sigismund inherited two crowns and eventually lost one, clinging desperately to the other. His reign over Poland, which began in 1587, was marked by religious conflict, military campaigns, and frequent political instability. He was determined to centralize power and strengthen Catholic influence, an ambition that made him popular with Rome and deeply unpopular with everyone else. As pressures mounted, so did the drinking. Contemporary records paint a picture of a monarch who never quite found the balance between ceremony and reality. Sigismund's official documents were impeccable, devout, deliberate, and full of idealism. But eyewitness accounts from court officials, foreign envoys, and even members of his own Sejm parliament tell a different story. Behind closed doors, the king could be erratic, emotionally volatile, and, on more than one occasion, visibly inebriated during state functions. Wine was his drink of choice, rich, fortified, and constantly flowing. Cellar records from Wawel Castle show an extraordinary amount of imported barrels, not for the court, but for the king's personal consumption. It wasn't unheard of for him to begin diplomatic meetings with a glass already in hand, or to dismiss Parliament early after an especially exhausting communion with the bottle. The Polish court, already splintered by factionalism, learned to navigate his moods like weather patterns. One moment he was philosophical and generous, the next accusatory, paranoid, or withdrawn. His temper was legendary. On multiple occasions, his decisions during wartime councils were questioned, not just for their aggression, but for the timing. Some of his most disastrous military orders, according to military historians, were made following days of feasting and heavy drinking, and yet his image remained oddly intact. Perhaps it was the robes, or the Latin prayers, or the sheer inertia of monarchy, but Sigismund was rarely publicly criticized for his drinking. Those who did speak out often did so in code, noting ill humors, distracted attention, or unsteady behavior in official reports. He ruled until 1632, dying not in disgrace but in declining relevance, his vision of a centralized Catholic empire having slowly crumbled under the weight of internal resistance, external enemies, and decisions made through a lens of cloudy red. And if Sigismund drank to command a divine vision no one else believed in, the next king would drink not for heaven or glory, but simply because he had nowhere left to go. a monarch exiled from his country and comforted only by champagne, sleep, and a monarchy that had already vanished. 23. King Umberto II of Italy. By the time King Umberto II of Italy opened his final bottle of champagne, the monarchy he had inherited no longer existed. He was the last king of Italy, and as history would have it, one of its most reluctant drinkers turned most committed exiles. Though his reign lasted just over a month, 34 days to be exact, Umberto's relationship with alcohol stretched across decades, intensifying not on the throne, but after he was forced off it. Born into the House of Savoy, Umberto was raised in stiff uniforms, polished manners, and dynastic expectations. His father, Victor Emmanuel III, was the monarch who reigned during Mussolini's rise and stayed conspicuously silent during the regime's worst atrocities. When World War II ended and the dust settled, Italy's monarchy had become more of a symbol of complicity than continuity. And when the Italian people were finally given the chance to vote, they chose a republic, narrowly and painfully. Umberto became king in May 1946 after his father abdicated in a last-ditch effort to preserve the crown. It was too late. In June, the monarchy was abolished by referendum. And just like that, the man who had spent his entire life preparing to rule found himself packing suitcases for exile. It was in Portugal, in a coastal villa outside Cascais, that Umberto began drinking in earnest. The shift was gradual. At first it was celebratory, perhaps even defiant. Bottles of champagne at dinner, aperitifs before lunch, wine with every meal. There was something theatrical about it, as if he were still toasting a royal future that might somehow be resurrected. But as the years stretched on and the monarchy remained buried, the drinking lost its sparkle. Friends and visitors described Umberto's exile as quietly dismal. He lived alone, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and formal photographs of a past that no longer returned his calls. His drinking became routine, then habitual. Champagne gave way to stronger spirits. Sleeping pills were added to the mix. His days became predictable. Slow breakfasts, long lunches, a solitary walk, then hours sitting with a glass in hand, looking out at the Atlantic like a man waiting for news that would never come. He never remarried after his estranged wife, Queen Marie-José, returned to Switzerland. He never returned to Italy. The Republic banned all male descendants of the House of Savoy from setting foot on Italian soil, a constitutional exile that lasted until 2002, long after Umberto's death. He died in Geneva in 1983, not disgraced, but forgotten. His passing noted by monarchist circles, ignored by the Republic he once tried to salvage. No throne, no funeral of state, just an old man in a foreign land whose crown had dissolved into history, and whose evenings for decades ended with a glass of something cold and sparkling. But while Umberto drank to soften exile's silence, the next king drank not out of loss but celebration, ruling over feasts, jesters, and drunken court politics, all with a goblet in one hand and Europe's fate in the other. 24. King James I of England. If history had subtitles, James I might be remembered as the scholar king who rarely put down his cup. He united the crowns of England and Scotland, commissioned the King James Bible, survived multiple assassination plots, and gave surprisingly long-winded speeches for someone so often drunk. But make no mistake, beneath the royal robes and theological essays, James was a man deeply committed to the civilizing power of drink, and not always in moderation. He came to the English throne in 1603 with high expectations and higher anxieties. As the first monarch of both England and Scotland, James viewed himself as a living symbol of divine order, a unifying figure sent to bring peace after decades of Tudor drama. Unfortunately, what he also brought was a well-established Scottish drinking habit, one that only flourished under England's warmer weather and richer cellars. Foreign ambassadors were the first to notice. Reports sent back to the courts of Europe routinely mentioned the king's fondness for wine, not as a passing indulgence, but as a fixed part of his routine. He swallows strong liquors like medicine, one wrote, noting James's tendency to begin diplomatic meetings already glassy-eyed and slurring. His speech, often long and rambling at the best of times, earned the nickname the Royal Swim, not for its clarity, but for its tendency to drift in and out of coherence. To his court, this wasn't exactly shocking. The Jacobean age was soaked in ale, mead, sack, and spiced wine. What raised eyebrows wasn't that James drank, but how early and how often. Court jesters joked that one could track the monarch's mood by the number of bottles removed from his chamber. Mornings were started with ale, evenings were prolonged with fortified wine, and long state dinners often ended with the king so flushed that courtiers learned to interpret policy by which foot he leaned on. Then there were the cordials. Like many monarchs of the period, James suffered from ailments both real and imagined. His physicians prescribed a rotating menu of opiate-laced tonics, herbal elixirs, and distilled liquors, all under the polite heading of constitutional support. These drinks, though medicinal in theory, were powerful in practice, combining alcohol, poppy extracts, and a generous pinch of early modern pseudoscience. It's difficult to say whether James was aware of how chemically altered his reality became. It's even more difficult to say whether he cared. Despite his consumption, James was surprisingly productive. He wrote essays on monarchy, witchcraft, and divine right. He hosted learned men, kept a vast library, and tried to turn governance into theology. But as his reign continued, his decision-making grew more erratic, his judgment cloudier, and his dependence on drink more entrenched. By the end of his life, James had become a contradictory figure, learned and incoherent, devout and dependent, celebrated and mocked, a monarch whose vision of order was slowly blurred by wine, tinctures, and his own restless tongue. And yet, if James drank to soften the stiffness of court and the dread of divine responsibility, the next king on our list drank to escape his past entirely. A former wild child turned warrior king who spent years trying to outgrow his own reputation and found the bottom of a tankard waiting. 25. King Henry V of England. Before he was the victor of Agincourt, before the speeches, the banners and the crown, Henry V was simply Prince Hal, a tavern-haunting, trouble-stirring heir to the English throne, with a goblet in one hand and a national expectation in the other. His youth was famously spent in the company of rogues and rascals, real and imagined, immortalized in Shakespeare's histories as the wayward prince who drank with commoners and ducked royal duty. But beneath the myth was a very real dependency on drink, one that shadowed him well into his reign, even as he tried to distance himself from the man he used to be. Born into political instability and raised under the heavy shadow of his father, Henry IV, the young prince responded to the weight of future kingship with rebellion. While his tutors tried to shape him into a ruler, Hal turned instead to alehouses and late-night escapades through the streets of London. He wasn't just avoiding responsibility, he was hiding from it, lubricated by endless mugs of strong ale and the approval of men who expected little of him. Contemporary accounts from courtiers and chroniclers suggest his drinking wasn't occasional, it was habitual. There are reports of the prince being publicly intoxicated, of brawls that began in taverns and ended in court, of nights that turned into mornings without memory. His companions, some historical, others literary, were known for their own epic thirsts. And while the line between theatrical storytelling and truth may blur, the reality remains. Hal drank deeply and often. When his father's health declined and the crown finally arrived in 1413, Henry transformed, at least on the surface. Gone were the drunken friends and rowdy knights. In their place, military discipline, religious devotion, and a hard, polished version of kingship that brooked no excess. He even ordered the arrest of former companions. It was, to many, a dramatic redemption arc. But redemption is rarely clean. Even during his military campaigns in France, accounts note that Henry maintained a steady intake of wine and strong ale, for strength, for warmth, and for the nerves. Campaigning in muddy fields and damp tents took a toll on the body, and drinking was not only common, it was encouraged. Still, for Henry, alcohol was more than hydration. It was continuity, a familiar habit carried from youth into war. His later years were marked by increased severity and a tightly controlled image. He ruled with conviction, fought with ferocity, and died young, at 35, from illness during yet another campaign in France. Whether his youthful habits contributed to his early death is impossible to know, but the transformation from pub-crawling prince to war-hardened king was never as clean as the chronicles liked to claim. And for all his efforts to rewrite his own story, the bottle left fingerprints, not as scandal, not as collapse, but as residue. The trace of a man who once drank to feel alive and later drank to remember how to feel human. The next monarch, however, didn't just drink to manage feeling. He was prescribed opiates to treat a darkness deeper than melancholy, and what began as treatment turned into silence, sleep, and the slow collapse of his royal mind. 26. King Philip V of Spain. Philip V didn't just wear the crown of Spain, he carried its weight like a sickness. Born a French Bourbon and placed on the Spanish throne by diplomatic design, Philip ruled an empire he neither chose nor particularly understood. His reign began in the smouldering aftermath of the War of the Spanish Succession and ended, twice, under clouds of confusion, withdrawal, and deep psychological instability. What held him together, barely, was a steady drip of laudanum, sleeping draughts, and the medieval hope that God would one day explain all of it. Philip's reign was a paradox. On paper, he ruled for more than 4 decades. In practice, he ruled in fragments, periods of intense involvement, followed by long stretches of detachment, depression, and mental collapse. From early on, those around him noted his strange silences, sudden tears, obsessive religious behavior, and crippling fatigue. His moods would swing from ecstatic devotion to deadened stupor. And as always in royal circles, when behavior could not be managed, it was medicated. Court physicians prescribed laudanum liberally. Tinctured opium was the 18th century cure for everything from melancholy to indigestion, and Philip became a routine user. For sleep, they offered sleeping powders, concoctions made with narcotics, alcohol, and crushed herbs meant to soften the brain and invite forgetfulness. Over time, the drugs became less about treatment and more about maintenance. They dulled the king's panic. They allowed him to function barely, but side effects soon replaced symptoms. Letters from his ministers speak of royal audiences conducted with glazed eyes, instructions repeated 3 or 4 times before registering. Philip began forgetting names, confusing years, and withdrawing from council matters. In his most severe periods, he refused to change clothes for days, obsessed over religious relics, and remained in bed, staring at the ceiling, whispering prayers no one else could hear. In 1724, Philip did something few monarchs ever dared. He abdicated. Citing ill health and divine inspiration, he handed the throne to his teenage son, Louis. It was meant to be permanent. It wasn't. Within 7 months, Louis died of smallpox, and Philip, under pressure from court factions and family, was forced back onto the throne. He returned not as a renewed ruler, but as a man even more dependent on chemical calm. His second reign was quieter, more withdrawn, increasingly governed by others. By the 1740s, Philip's condition was described as vegetative in private court documents. He still signed decrees, still wore the sash and crown, but his mind often wandered off mid-sentence. The opiates, by then, were as familiar as his rosary. They numbed the terror of his thoughts, slowed the racing repetitions, and turned a once ambitious monarch into a barely present sovereign. He died in 1746, not in disgrace, but in dissociation, his name still gilded in history books, even as his last years had been spent mostly in bed, drugged, dazed and distant. And yet, his slow-motion unravelling echoes in the next royal story. A queen who met the modern world with trembling hands and a pharmacy of tranquilizers, each dose a whispered attempt to quiet the demands of duty. 27. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands. She was a child queen, a wartime symbol and the steely face of Dutch resilience, until the world changed and her body refused to keep up. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands reigned through some of the most tumultuous decades in European history, outlasting monarchies, wars, and political upheaval. But the strength she projected in public, the stubborn defiance, the radio addresses from exile, the image of a monarch who would not bow, came at a private cost. In her later years, long after abdication, Wilhelmina's world narrowed. Chronic illness took hold, and with it came the medicines. Morphine, tranquilizers, sedatives, sleep aids, all prescribed, all familiar, all increasingly difficult to live without. She ascended the throne in 1890 at just 10 years old, becoming queen officially at 18. For much of her early reign, Wilhelmina was fiercely independent, famously sharp-tongued, and deeply protective of the Dutch royal institution. She stood firm through World War I neutrality, survived the German invasion of World War II by fleeing to Britain, and became a beacon of defiance in exile. Her broadcasts to the occupied Netherlands were stirring, steady, and, to many, the voice of a homeland that refused to break. But after the war, something shifted. The Queen returned to a country shattered by conflict and unsure of its place in the post-war world. She abdicated in 1948, citing exhaustion, but it was more than that. Wilhelmina had been ill for some time, suffering from circulatory problems, respiratory complications, and chronic pain. The transition from monarch to private citizen, even a royal one, was not easy. Her public role diminished, and so did her strength. In its place came a quiet reliance on chemical relief. Doctors prescribed morphine for pain, then tranquilizers for nerves, then sleep aids for the insomnia that accompanied both. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't even particularly unusual. This was an era when powerful medications were seen as symbols of modern medicine, tools for comfort, not causes for concern. And for Wilhelmina, the drugs worked until they didn't. Visitors in her later years described a woman increasingly detached from conversation, drifting in and out of alertness, still regal but more remote. She remained devout, still read scripture, still spoke with conviction, but only when her energy allowed. The rest of the time was filled with silence, stillness, and a pharmacist's rotation of relief. She died in 1962, quietly, without fanfare. No state crisis, no abdication scandal, just a former queen who had carried a nation through fire and who spent her final decade trying to ease the weight of all that came after. Her story doesn't end in disgrace, but in stillness, a slow fading, not from history, but from herself. And the next monarch didn't have time to fade. Paranoia, instability, and the crackling pressure of Balkan politics drove him into the arms of his own vices, where alcohol became both shield and poison, until fate intervened in the most final way. 28. King Alexander V of Yugoslavia. There are monarchs who are born into legend, and there are monarchs who are born into the aftermath of someone else's mistakes. King Alexander I of Yugoslavia belonged firmly to the latter. His reign was a grand experiment in keeping incompatible nations from collapsing into mutual suspicion, and his life, even before the crown, was a study in survival through constant pressure. By the time the world began calling him Alexander the Unifier, his body had already learned the rhythm of stress, exhaustion, and alcohol, an unsteady trinity that defined both the man and his monarchy. He inherited chaos. Yugoslavia was less a country than an arranged marriage, a patchwork of ethnicities, religions, and resentments forced together under a single flag after World War I. As its king, Alexander was expected to make it work. And for a while, it seemed he might. He had the discipline of a soldier and the demeanor of a statesman. But under that disciplined veneer was a man privately unraveling, his nerves stretched thin by the weight of keeping peace where none wanted to exist. By the late 1920s, the political tensions that had simmered beneath the surface erupted into open hostility. Parliament descended into shouting matches. Assassination attempts became predictable headlines. Alexander began sleeping less, eating little, and relying on a steady intake of alcohol to quiet both body and mind. He preferred cognac, strong, fast, unpretentious, the kind of drink that didn't ask for ceremony, only surrender. Courtiers and aides recorded his habit of pouring himself a glass before meetings, another during, and one more afterward to steady the hands. He was no public drunk. On the contrary, Alexander remained composed, articulate, and even charming in official settings. His tolerance was legendary, so more accurately tragic. He could hold an entire state dinner's worth of liquor without stumbling, without slurring, without betraying anything beyond the faintly tired eyes of a man who had forgotten what sobriety felt like. Diplomats admired his stamina, his doctors quietly worried, but what truly eroded him was not the alcohol itself, but what it represented, the slow-burning anxiety that never left his side. The king's correspondence from the early 1930s reads like a man talking to ghosts. He writes of sleepless nights, of constant pressure, of feeling pursued by my own people's mistrust. His wife, Queen Maria, noted that he often stayed awake past dawn, pacing, rereading reports, and muttering to himself in frustration. He drinks too much, she wrote once in a letter never meant for public eyes, but the silence of his position is louder than any warning I can give. In 1929, he made a desperate gamble. Dissolving Parliament, he declared himself dictator in the name of unity, the January 6th dictatorship, as it came to be known. For the first few months, it worked. The violence receded. The state for once obeyed, but at what cost? The king's health deteriorated rapidly. He suffered migraines, tremors, and what his physicians politely called episodes of exhaustion. Their solution, as always in that era, was a cocktail of sedatives and sleeping pills, occasionally layered with morphine for nerves. It only deepened his dependency. He took the edge off with brandy and ended the day with medication that blurred thought into silence. By 1934, Alexander was a man frayed to the core, too tired to sleep, too wary to rest, too disciplined to fall apart in public. His aides described him as haunted, driven, drinking more frequently. When he left for Marseille that October on an official visit to France, he carried with him a small travel case of brandy and pills. For comfort, one attendant later recalled. He never came back. The king's assassination in Marseille shocked Europe, but in a dark way, it ended what might have been an even slower, quieter undoing. His dependence had already taken its toll. His mind was dulled, his heart strained, his spirit threadbare. The man who had spent his life forcing a fractured nation to stay together was already fragmenting inside himself. In death, Alexander became myth, the martyr king who died for unity. In life, he had been something lonelier, a man who drank not for pleasure, but for survival, holding a kingdom together one glass at a time. And from his fall, we turn back to an empire where indulgence was almost theology, where emperors saw pleasure as power, and one of them in particular blurred the line between intoxication and insanity, until Rome itself began to shake. 29. Emperor Nero of Rome. History remembers Nero as many things: tyrant, arsonist, artist, egomaniac, but rarely as something as ordinary as an addict. Yet beneath the flames of his legend and the distortions of propaganda, there exists the picture of a man who drank and drugged his way through paranoia, insomnia, and power until reality itself seemed like another one of his theatrical productions. If most emperors ruled through ceremony, Nero ruled through performance. And to keep performing, he needed a steady chorus of stimulants, sedatives, and the deep red haze of too much wine. He was barely 17 when he ascended the throne in AD 54, a boy emperor coached by philosophers but surrounded by flatterers. His early rule, guided by Seneca and Burrus, was measured and promising, but as soon as the restraints loosened, the pace of excess began. Nero's Rome was a city of indulgence, baths, banquets, poetry contests, and orgiastic spectacles, and the emperor became its most restless participant. Every feast was an audition, every toast a rehearsal. The ancient chroniclers were not subtle in their descriptions. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all write of Nero's endless banquets and his preference for heavy, spiced wines mixed with poppy infusions, known in some circles as vino papaveratum, a hallucinogenic brew that blurred vision and quieted nerves. It was a fashionable addiction among the Roman elite, a drink that softened the edges of guilt and made every fantasy seem plausible. For Nero, it offered something more essential, a way to drown the constant static of insecurity. Even as emperor, Nero never escaped the fear of disapproval. He wanted to be loved as an artist, not just obeyed as a ruler. He sang, he composed, he performed before terrified audiences who dared not applaud too little. And with each performance, his craving for escape grew. Wine became his armor against failure, opium-laced potions his shield against insomnia. Physicians, terrified of contradicting him, prescribed sleep draughts that would have felled an ordinary man. Nero built up a tolerance. He would drink through the effects, demanding stronger doses and longer nights. Rome noticed. Senators whispered of his divine drunkenness. Courtiers began to time their flattery to the clink of his cup. The emptier the goblet, the more generous the praise. But addiction, like empire, is difficult to control. The emperor's moods became unpredictable. He oscillated between manic energy and violent despair, alternately hosting midnight races through the city streets and locking himself in his chambers for days. The intoxicants fed his paranoia. He saw conspiracies everywhere, in the Senate, in his own family, even among his servants. He ordered executions at the slightest hint of betrayal, only to regret them hours later in tearful, drugged remorse. He turned to priests and astrologers for reassurance, who in turn offered potions and rituals meant to purify the humors. Most were mixtures of wine and narcotics. Each promised clarity, none delivered it. By the mid-60s, Nero's dependence had become a state matter. The treasury drained under the weight of his spectacles, his late-night gifts, and his growing entourage of enablers. His physical condition deteriorated, swollen, sleepless, his once boyish charm replaced by a puffy, feverish intensity. He drank more to quiet the headaches and the tremors, and then more still to forget why he started. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, whether or not he truly caused it, marked the point of no return. The emperor, who fancied himself divine, now roamed the ruins of his city, half-drunk, composing elegies for marble and ash. When rebellion finally came, Nero found himself abandoned, trembling, and, for the first time, sober enough to understand what he had become. His reign ended not in glory, but in hallucination, a man undone by power, isolation, and the narcotic haze he once mistook for inspiration. Nero wanted to feel infinite. What he achieved was oblivion. And from the ruins of Rome, the story moves north to a colder, quieter kingdom, where another king sought relief not in pageantry but in pills, marching across battlefields under the influence of painkillers that turned courage into confusion. 30. King Charles the XII of Sweden. They called him the Warrior King, the Lion of the North, and in darker corners of Europe, simply the Madman of the North. Charles XII of Sweden was not a man interested in court balls, coronations, or ceremony. He wore simple clothes, slept on the ground with his soldiers, and spent nearly his entire reign on horseback, waging one war after another in frozen fields and distant lands. He seemed built for war, physically tireless, tactically gifted, utterly fearless. But even iron cracks, and even warrior kings bleed. By his early 20s, Charles had already been wounded multiple times in battle, surviving bullets, sabers, and the bitter frost of endless campaigning. His body was a map of injuries, swelling joints, damaged nerves, deep tissue pain that never fully healed. For a while he endured it. But pain has its own politics, and by the time Charles reached his 30s, he had begun leaning heavily on what his physicians called soothing tonics. What they meant, of course, were opiates, and plenty of them. Sweden at the time had no shortage of medical ambition. Doctors traveling with the King's army were equipped with laudanum, tinctures of poppy and alcohol, camphor mixtures, and increasingly popular herbal sedatives. These remedies were administered liberally, especially to Charles, who often refused more traditional care in favor of being alert and marching. Ironically, the substances meant to keep him active eventually began slowing him down, just not in ways that showed on the surface. The King's legendary stoicism, the calm with which he faced artillery, the blank expression that rarely shifted even in crisis, may have been less temperament and more chemistry. His generals noted moments of eerie detachment. He would sit quietly for hours before a battle, eyes unfocused, saying little, then suddenly give orders in bursts of intensity. These patterns became more pronounced during the later years of the Great Northern War, especially after his near-fatal foot injury in 1713, which left him immobile for months and deepened his reliance on morphine-like painkillers. And still, he refused to stop, refused to abdicate, refused to consider peace. By this point, his worldview had narrowed to military maps and quiet withdrawal. He rarely returned to Stockholm. Letters from ministers speak of a monarch increasingly isolated, speaking in cryptic phrases, refusing food but demanding medicine. Some feared he had lost his grip on reality. Others feared he hadn't and was simply choosing not to return from the front. He was known to drink, though not in the riotous style of earlier Swedish monarchs. His alcohol use was functional, quiet, deliberate. Brandy to warm him in winter, wine to help dull the wounds. But the drugs, those were constant. He travelled with a personal surgeon whose saddlebags included opium tinctures, sleeping powders, and what was then called cordial water, a euphemism for sedatives strong enough to silence even the loudest nerve endings. In 1718, while besieging the Norwegian fortress of Fredrikstad, Charles was struck by a bullet to the head and killed instantly. To this day, conspiracy theories linger about whether it came from enemy fire or an assassin within his own ranks. Regardless of the truth, what remained was a kingdom exhausted, a war without end, and a monarch whose body had long been numbed to the pain of both. Charles XII left no heirs, no treaties, no great monuments, just an empire in decline, an army too tired to march, and a legacy frozen in time. That of a king who fought until the very end, sustained less by glory than by the quiet drip of battlefield medicine and the unspoken costs of ruling through pain. And with that final shot in the snow, our gallery of royal addiction comes to a close. A procession of crowns and chemicals, of rulers undone not only by history, but by the substances they used to endure it.